thank you very much for the invitation and for the presentation so far. I have learned a lot, and I hope that my contribution will add to the very interesting discussions that are going on. My name is Dewilde, and I'm a professor of multilingualism in education at the University of Oslo. And I will be talking about multilingualism as a resource. And I'm especially interested in linking in and out of school practices. And we've heard a lot about out of school, but also people saying how can teachers use what is happening out of school inside of school. Do I think? Yes, thank you. A bit about my background. I'm like the previous speaker, I'm from the Flemish-speaking part of Belgium, but moved to Norway when I was 18. And I'm educated as a teacher in Norwegian and English language and literature. And after I graduated, I taught in reception classes for newly arrived students. So these are also the students that I'm particularly interested in. As an academic, I wrote my PhD thesis about minoritized multilingual teachers or multilingual teachers with a migrant background. After that, I've also followed young people in and outside of school, seeing how they use multilingualism, for example, on Facebook or on other social media, to think about how their writing practices can be worked with by teachers in school. So very often, a lot of their writing exercises or writing that is going on in school is multilingual. But I saw that, for example, on Facebook or on Instagram, multilingual students use a lot of multilingual practices. So I've worked with teachers how to recognize those practices and how to further develop them in a school setting. What I've worked with now the last years is on multilingualism as a resource in adult basic education. And in all my research, I use a resource perspective on multilingualism. So today I'll also be sharing insights from my last study in adult basic education. Very broad and very what is bilingual education? Kasdan and Snow have said that it's a very simple concept for a complex phenomenon. So bilingual education may mean different things in different settings and can refer to education for students who already have a command of 2 or more languages, students learning a new language, students who master the majority language or languages in a society, and students with a minority background learning the school language. Colin Baker, he has said that bilingual education refers to education in 1 or more languages. But Ophelia Garcia has added a very important point, I think, that an overarching goal is to help students become global citizens and contribute to increase justice and democratic participation. And I think that's a goal that many of us in the room are very concerned about. How do we make global citizens? And how do we ensure that all participants in society are able to contribute in democratic processes? As we all know, there are a lot of discourses, different discourses on multilingualism in society. And I have Norwegian examples, but I'm sure you will recognize the examples from your context. This is the previous Minister of Education who wanted all other languages than Norwegian prohibited in school. Another example is a politician at that time for the Labour Party who was in the media saying that he was afraid that parents who speak another language than Norwegian at home, that the children would have fewer chances of succeeding in school and society. Luckily, and very often these views are not based on research, so these are also political ideologies that are praised by influential politicians, so that's why it's important to pay attention to them. Luckily, there are, of course, other discourses here. An example from a multilingual parent meeting where the school worked on mapping students' linguistic backgrounds and using and training the students as translators at general parent meetings. So not personal meetings about particular students, but they wanted to recruit minority parents to take more active action in the school, and had this meeting where I think 15 or 20 students translated important information in other languages than Norwegian. During COVID, so I have to say something about the pandemic. I thought a campaign in Norwegian media by Schibsted was very important. I think it was the first time that the health authorities communicated very important health information in other languages than Norwegian. So very often we think our important information is given in Norwegian only. At this time, you didn't have to know Norwegian to get access to very important information. Then there's the rap group, the Norwegian rap group, Karpe, who sings in a lot of languages, also what we call minoritized languages. So minority languages that don't have a very high status in the Norwegian society. For example, Gujarati or other minority languages. And this takes me to my next point, which I think is very important, that multilingualism isn't a neutral concept, or it's not a neutral phenomenon. I think the CenterPeregrity Dynamics displayed by Kritika and Kelly Holmes are very useful. That multilingualism in the center has very high value. It's considered as normal, desirable, appreciated. And for example, in schools, you can think about English, French, German, Spanish, whereas languages spoken by immigrants or refugees are more in the periphery of the school. They are often found to be marginalized, less worth, or even useless. So I think it's important when we talk about multilingualism that we talk about what kind of multilingualism and who are the multilinguals. My research is mainly focused on the multilingualism in the periphery, not because I don't value or acknowledge or appreciate multilingualism in the center, but I think it is very important to look at the periphery because it tells us how we as a society treat both the language and the language users in the periphery. And of course, we want the periphery to come to the center. And I think education can play a very important role here. One of the perspectives I have worked with since Ofelia Garcia's important book in 2009 is on TransLanguaging. And TransLanguaging is one way of looking at languages. It's defined not as an approach to bilingualism that is not centered around language, as is often the case, but around the bilingual practice, which can easily be observed. So in other ways of studying multilingualism, it can be very focused on the language. For example, what is correct grammar? What is a correct way of building up a sentence, or what is native-like pronunciation? TransLanguaging has a different take, and they start from the point of the user. So the question they ask is, how is language used by multilingual people? And of course, this will be much more dynamic than the language we find in dictionaries or grammars. And I think particularly for people who grow up with different languages, but for example, who imagine a person coming from Somalia, learning to speak Somali, but maybe never having had the chance for education, so unable to write in Somalia. Moving from a country to Yemen, getting the first schooling in Arabic, so they may learn to read and write in Arabic, and coming to Norwegian. Of course, that person will use their linguistic resources in much more dynamic ways, and maybe not in native-like or most likely not in native-like ways. So translanguaging is concerned with how can we acknowledge non-native-like use of language. Also considering how all resources are very important for a person's identity. Not maybe the languages that you know very well, but maybe your parents speak a language which you still think is important for your identity, but maybe you're not to speak it. Translanguaging requires different teacher roles, and Garcia has set up 4 roles, which I think is quite useful for teachers to think about. The first role is the role of the detective. So if you can't, if grammars or dictionaries are not your starting point, but the people are your starting point, then she says you need to act as a detective, getting to know how students use language and make meaning. And of course, this may be in very dynamic ways. She says that you should also be a co-learner, so trying to learn from your students and distributing agency equally in the classroom. And this also leads, or an important point is here that you may have a classroom with many Arabic speakers, but only 2 Thai, for example. So trying to co-learn with your students, but then also think, how can students learn from each other? Are there any groups that may dominate than others? So this is also an important part of this. She talks about the teacher as the builder, creating affinity spaces, so spaces where everybody feels comfortable using a new language and talking about issues that are of concern. And finally, and maybe the most difficult role is the role of the transformer. So as a teacher trying to change social reality of adult migrants. And an example of this can be educating for multilingual language helpers in the school. In some schools, there is no tradition at all to employ multilingual assistants. So as a teacher, you could raise that to the management, and that would be a way of changing what is happening in the school. So the project I want to talk to you about is a project financed by Skills Norway, where I was the project leader and Ingrid Rodriguez-Weiler was together with me. We had help of 14 multilingual assistants, and we worked with 5 teachers in adult basic education to implement pedagogical translanguaging. There were 5 adult students in the classroom, and you see the multiplicity of the languages at the bottom. So we acted as researchers, as detectives in the first place. What we found was that many of the students used translation of new words in Norwegian into other languages to understand, remember, and practice at home. And here you see some examples also using their iPhone. What I find particularly interesting in adult education is that the students were allowed to use their phones, whereas in many other school types, very often there's this phone hotel where students need to hand back their phone, but we saw that many of the students really use their phones in very resourceful ways. Some also wrote translations in one language and recorded in another, as you can see here. A Kurdish student wrote, she's able to write in Arabic, but her strongest language is Sorani Kurdish, and she made an audio file for the teacher, so using both languages in a resourceful way. What we also discovered, what I find quite interesting, is that also at the very, very beginners level, so in the class where they have so-called non-formal schooling, they wrote down how new words in Norwegian are pronounced in alphabets other than Latin. So first I thought that I saw Pashto and that I saw Arabic, with our multilingual assistants showed that we see the Pashto and Arabic scripts, but what they do is that they write how the word is pronounced in Norwegian, so to remember and also to rehearse outside of school. So I think this is an example of why we can never underestimate these learners and why it's important to act as a detective and discover how they use multilingual resources in ways that we don't really think as native speakers. The language portraits, I think maybe some of you are familiar with this. This is the task we used together with the teachers to map all the resources. So this is from a speaker. The school had noted down that her strongest language was Tigrinya, but then when you see all the languages she's able to speak, we see that she's learning Norwegian. She grew up close to the border with Sudan, so she was also quite proficient in Arabic. Her native language was in fact Tigre, but she also spoke Tigrinya, and then at the bottom a little English. The teachers often talked about what's your mother tongue, but for a learner like this, the concept of mother tongue doesn't really make very much sense because she's proficient in many different languages in different ways. So this was also something the teachers increasingly learned about throughout the project, how to ask for multilingual resources in a way that made sense for the different learners. Another practice we saw a lot very spontaneously was that students discussed words and tasks with others with similar language backgrounds. So there were a lot of Arabic speakers, but then we discovered that some Somali learners were also proficient in Arabic, some Kurdish were proficient in Arabic, and then there was one Tigrinya student. And the teacher organized the classroom in a way where the one Somali speaker who was also proficient in Arabic was sitting next to the Arabic speakers, and then the other one wasn't. So you could really see how the class helped each other, very much basing their communication on Arabic and on some English as well. I will skip this one. Another point which I think is interesting, talking about out of school learning, is we've been very concerned with what do you do when there's only one Swahili speaker, or what do you do when there's only one Thai speaker? Some teachers started using more English, for example, for the Thai and Filipino speaker, but here the Swahili speaker didn't have any common language with anyone in the classroom. So we thought it was important to map her network outside of school. And so the teacher did this for us, and she says that I'm the only one in the class who knows Swahili. I usually don't say anything when I really need help. But we discovered that she, in fact, has a small network of Swahili speakers who have been in Norway for a longer time, who are proficient in Norwegian. So the teacher could give homework, for example, and the student could take it outside of school to her network and get help in Swahili and bring it to the classroom. So here I think the informal learning, again, is very important. One other thing that we discovered and that we work quite a lot with is not building on similar language, but building on similar experiences. So we had this one Tigrinya speaker who very often felt she used the teacher too much, but there was no other way of seeking help. And also everybody was able to use their phones to translate into Arabic, for example. But Tigrinya at the time of our study wasn't on Google Translate. I now recently learned that their Wikipedia has picked up, so that more pages are being translated into Tigrinya. But here, the student, there's talk about tea. So the bilingual teacher, Zahra, she asks, do you make cinnamon tea? She asks that to two Somali students. And she says, you have very good tea, how do you make it? What's the name of the tea you have in Syria? Asking another participant. And one of the Somali participants, she finds a picture of cloves on Wikipedia. And another student excitedly says that they also use cloves in tea in Eritrea. And that was the first time we really saw the student smile in the classroom. So she doesn't have any similar language with any of the participants, but she has similar experiences. So when working with the teachers, we looked a lot, we talked a lot about topics that could potentially be similar to include all learners. So this, for example, is we had a project on good health, and the students worked in language groups. So there was a small Thai group, Somali group, Afghan group, and Syrian group. They talked in their own languages to talk about what is good health in their home countries. And then there was one mixed group who could talk with the Norwegian teacher to also make to also work with good health. And the teacher said that postponing introducing the Norwegian context was very valuable. So very often teachers would say, this is what good health is in Norway, how is it in your countries? Just asking a few students, but this kind of multilingual task where students are first in language groups and then report on all their context, and then at the very end introduce the Norwegian context, made for a different dynamic, and where students really felt that they could raise their own perspectives. So we also worked with the body where they could write in the languages that they wanted, to Norwegian and I think it's Thai you see here. So to sum up, multilingual language practices can be of an inspiration to teaching. So when teachers act as detectives, they can discover the multilingual practices also going on outside of the classroom and bring them into the classroom. We also found that TransLanguaging is much more than language, but it's also about building on people's experiences and knowledge. And we found that working with language groups or multilingual language helpers, we also have a couple of, is a valuable way of gaining access to these experiences and knowledge. And in pedagogical translanguaging, teachers take on new roles that advance joint exploration and collaboration. The very long link, but that's a link to the English website. And otherwise, I have my email address here. Thank you.
So we are open for questions from the audience or from Zoom through Henrik, I guess. Yeah.
Thank you very much for very interesting presentation, especially with very concrete examples of what can be done in the classroom. I was thinking about, I don't know if you know Jim Cummings in Canada, and their work with identity texts, which is more comprehensive than the examples that you give of various possibilities where people, of the students, actually make stories, fairy tales in their own languages, and that's used. Is that something which you have experienced also in your project?
Yes, I'm very familiar with Jim Cummings working with the identity text.
Yeah.
I supervise many master's students, and one of them has used identity texts with young people, and she wanted them to write in multilingual ways, and they didn't. They wrote it was they also had a part of this. The identity text was writing poetry, and they wrote poetry in Norwegian and in their strongest language, but it was very difficult for them to write in a more multilingual way. So I think the identity texts the students have been were more advanced. So these it would be interesting, but at the level that we worked with in the project, the students didn't write full texts.
Okay.
But one of the things I really like with the identity text is that you can showcase it. And I remember that they also invited in parents. So I'm also, I think it's very important also to show non-native products. And I've done that in a project with young people, But then as their Norwegian became better as well, they discovered that I hadn't corrected all their mistakes. Then I had made a big poster that we put in the library. So you have all these expectations about what is a good text and what is good language. So it's quite sensitive, I think, but yeah, it's very important. Thank you.